Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. With the 250th birthday of America just around the corner, I think it makes sense to look back at just how much has changed. When you've been a country for 2.5 centuries, some things are bound to change. High-profile public figures have come and gone. What issues are salient has often shifted, and political loyalties have transformed. So much is different over the course of 250 years. And with America's 250th birthday, let's look at just how far along we've come. Many aspects have gotten better over 250 years. Some have gotten worse, and some are just as flawed as they were before. Regardless, let's look at some of the most seismic, overarching changes to American political culture and life. Now, of course, there are way too many things to cover at one time and in one episode, so we'll look at some of the most seminal and or lesser-known transformations in American politics. And at the end, we'll consider what may be some of the biggest changes to come. So, let's first talk about voting rights and citizenship. Now, arguably the most noticeable and well-known change in American politics has been the expansion of suffrage, which is voting rights. I know it sounds a little bit like suffering, but really suffrage is a good thing. Now, that's one of the most notable, well-known changes, but some people may not know the full extent of it. In episode 32 of this podcast, I talked a lot more in depth about how much voting rights has expanded over time, but we'll condense it down into a shorter version here. So, voting used to be heavily restricted by who could use it, who was actually allowed to vote. In fact, a lot of people don't realize early on, even being a white male was not enough. You had to have property because they were often considered people who did not have property were often considered not educated enough, that they didn't have enough stake in public affairs, and that they were too dependent on other men to have their own will. But not too far along, property rights were the first major barrier to go. And some of that took a little while in some states. In other states, it was much quicker. But then you saw the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, which gave the right to vote for black men, not for every racial minority. That would take a little bit longer, and get to that in just a moment. But the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, which gave the right to vote for women. And then throughout the first half of the 20th century, you saw more racial minorities granted citizenship and therefore could get the right to vote. Now, the 15th Amendment technically was not abridging, or it said that you could not abridge the right to vote based on race, but a lot of different racial minorities weren't considered citizens, so they didn't actually get the right to vote. So things that changed that were laws like the Indian Citizenship Act for Native Americans in 1924, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 for Chinese Americans, and then the McCarran-Walter Act for all Asian Americans. Though they kept some immigration quotas in place, it granted citizenship to a lot more Americans of Asian descent. Then in 1961, you saw the 23rd Amendment, which gave Washington, D.C. residents the ability to vote for president. And then the 24th Amendment in 1964, which abolished poll taxes. So in a way, it enfranchised poor voters, because poll taxes, basically you had to pay a fee to be able to vote. And almost always that was targeted against black voters because they tended to be more poor as a result of Jim Crow laws. And then the 26th Amendment in 1971 decreased the minimum voting age from 21 to 18 years old. Now, some states had already been doing that, but this made it across the board, uniform. You're going to be voting if you're 18 years old, no matter what. So now more people than ever are able to register to vote. And registering to vote is fairly easy for the most part, though certainly not for everyone. and how easy it is to actually cast a ballot as a voter is a bit of a mixed bag depending on where you go. And so the biggest current battleground when it comes to voting rights is for former and convicted felons. So those are things like, should we automatically restore voting rights for felons after they get out of prison? Or should it only be for nonviolent offenders who get out? Should you be able to vote as somebody who's currently in prison? And all sorts of different ways that states handled this issue. But that's the biggest battleground you see right now. But generally speaking, voting rights have come an incredibly long way in 250 years. It's not specifically targeted against demographic groups anymore. Not, at least not when it comes to race and gender and age. Although some people would perhaps argue that 16-year-olds should get the right to vote. But that's a whole other can of worms. So the next thing to talk about, and this is a very wide-ranging discussion, is changes to elections and nominating processes. Now, elections in America are largely administered at the local level, and most laws are set by the states. The U.S. Constitution doesn't really set a whole lot of rules when it comes to elections. It was mostly left up to the states. And so there has been a ton of change in how these elections work as states have shifted in their political ideologies and partisanship, and all sorts of state-specific factors have come into play. And there's too much to cover here, but there's a lot of this that is covered in episodes 31 and 32 of the podcast and various other ones along the way. But we'll discuss a few of the more considerable changes. I won't go in depth with the 12th Amendment. That had changed presidential elections where previously first place vote getter was president, and then the second place vote getter was vice president. Now, obviously, it's a lot different. You have presidents and vice presidents run on the same ticket, and that's because of the 12th Amendment. So I think it bears mentioning here, but I don't want to go too in depth with it. There are some other ones that I want to focus on that are less well known. And one of those is the process of casting a ballot. So these days, you go to a polling booth, you fill out the bubbles, you put it in the scanner, and it says you voted. Well, in the really early days, it was actually done by a voice vote. You actually went to your polling place and said the name that you wanted to vote for, and then it was tabulated. Paper ballots became increasingly common throughout the 1800s, but even then it wasn't standardized. Newspapers could print out blank ballots that readers could take and pull it off the newspaper and then fill it out and then bring it to a polling place. And also, even political parties could print out their own ballots, which, what could go wrong there? Conveniently, these ballots just had the party's candidates. And so they targeted in particular, new immigrants coming to America by promising them housing and jobs and so on in exchange for party loyalty. It was a really easily exploitable system for them to use. And as the 19th century wore on, a lot more reforms would happen. Public demand for secret balloting ramped up, and it was adopted in the waning years of the 19th century. And an array of machines used for elections since the secret ballot have been invented, including lever machines and punch cards, and now optical scanners and scantrons that you see today. Another way that voting or elections have tremendously changed is that we directly vote for U.S. senators now. And that was through the 17th Amendment in 1913. U.S. senators actually used to be selected by the respective state legislatures. And in fact, some governors also used to be chosen by state legislatures back in the really early days, in the early 19th century. Many framers of the U.S. Constitution had not intended for direct election of the U.S. Senate like they decided for the U.S. House. Remember, not all the framers agreed on everything, and some of them wanted more direct election for the legislative branch in general. But it was part of this big compromise called the Connecticut Compromise, which made the U.S. House based on population and direct election, and the U.S. Senate would give 2 senators, no matter how big your state was, and make them indirectly elected by the state legislature. So the people would vote for state legislatures, and then the state legislatures would vote for the U.S. senators. And some of those reasons included preventing mob rule and excessive democracy, and protecting states' rights by providing state governments a way to check the federal government, and that state legislatures would be more, quote-unquote, enlightened in choosing these U.S. senators because these U.S. Senate seats were so prestigious and impactful on federal policy. Now, whether you agree with those reasons or not, that was why the U.S. Senate was made the way it was back then, but in the early 20th century, that changed, and for over 100 years now, we have directly elected our U.S. Senate in a similar fashion to the U.S. House. Another way that you may not realize how elections have changed incredibly, more so the nominating process, is how much we've shifted from caucuses to primaries. In the 18th and 19th centuries, caucuses and conventions were how candidates for office were chosen. Caucuses were private meetings held by members of the party, though not necessarily by secret ballot. Sometimes they would openly discuss it. And in conventions were more general meetings where delegates of the party attended. But in the early 1900s, during the Progressive Era, one of the reforms that was picking up traction, that was gaining steam, was the idea of primaries, where a set of candidates would run for the party nomination and then we'd vote for them directly. It was seen as a way to address political corruption and to take power away from political machines and party bosses that had been controlling nominations for decades and decades. Now you almost never see caucuses. Occasionally do, like in Iowa, and conventions have had a lot less direct control over elections since then. And this is one of the reasons why people say political parties in America are relatively weak these days, because voters have a much more direct choice in who becomes the party's nominees as opposed to the parties themselves picking and choosing and saying you have to deal with this whether you like it or not. So occasionally you see those caucuses, and conventions still happen a lot, but they're a bit more of a formality now. But occasionally you still see caucuses have some impact. And then lastly, I want to talk about changes in the ways that presidential candidates campaign, a particular way that you might not realize. And I'm talking about travel in this case. Now, obviously, transportation has tremendously improved since the Founding Fathers' time, but you may not realize just how much it has changed how presidents have and presidential candidates have campaigned. Today, presidential candidates travel all around the country. They do countless interviews, debates, all that jazz, but it wasn't anything remotely like that to start off. In the early days of the Republic, campaigning for yourself was actually seen as unbecoming and disapproved of and inappropriate. It was the idea, according to the Founding Fathers, not necessarily these specific words, but the idea was that the office seeks the man, not the other way around. So, how did you campaign? Other people did it on your behalf. Somebody that you know in federal government or in states say, hey, you know what? I think, you know who would be a really good candidate? My buddy George, John, Thomas. They would make a really good president. And let me tell you why they would make a really good president. So people would campaign on your behalf if you wanted to be a presidential candidate. William Henry Harrison in 1840 was really the first presidential candidate to actually tour and give speeches, though successive major party nominees weren't really successful with that strategy. William Henry Harrison was able to parlay it into a 1-month presidency. He died 1 month into the presidency, but it worked out for him. And so when James Garfield was campaigning in 1880, he kind of looked at how previous presidential candidates had gone about it, and instead of stomping around the country to give speeches, he decided he would conduct the first front porch campaign, where people would actually come to the candidate's house to hear him speak. Instead of him traveling to you, you travel to him, which sounds insane these days, especially with concerns about security and privacy and knowing about where people live. But that's how it was at that point. Benjamin Harrison in the 1888 presidential election campaign, he did the same thing. He used a front porch campaign. William McKinley did it in 1896. Though front porch campaigns after that would decline in use for a while. Warren Harding, when he campaigned in the 1920 election, he used a front porch campaign, and it was used in 1924, but even by that point, it was falling out of use. And in 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt was running to try to return to the presidency, he had already served 2 terms before, but tried to get back in as a third-party candidate because he was very disgruntled with William Taft, who he had basically deemed his successor. And so what Teddy did is he embarked on one of the first whistle-stop tours, where candidates traveled on trains and then voters would come to the train stops to hear them speak. So instead of you traveling around the country to meet voters where they are and voters traveling to go meet you where you are as a presidential candidate, it was kind of something in the middle where presidential candidates would travel to somewhere, but voters would flock to that area to go and see that presidential candidate speak. And of course, as the 20th century progressed, candidates would more frequently travel around with faster trains, continually improving cars, flights, and so on, as technology and transportation has gotten better and better. And now it has since become expected that legitimate presidential candidates will travel basically all over the country. Now, how about shifting party loyalties? We've had a 2-party system for almost the entirety of America's existence, save for prior to the U.S. Constitution's ratification, when there were no formal parties, and a short period after the dissolution of the Federalist Party, when it was just the Democratic Party that existed on its own for a little while. But how those parties have looked and where their power lies have shifted tremendously over time. The parties themselves have changed somewhat. Federalists dissolved, then there was that one-party rule for a little while, and then Whigs filled the vacuum. And then they dissolved and were replaced by Republicans, and now it's been Republicans versus Democrats ever since the 1850s. Now, depending on who you ask, the Democratic Party is the same as the Democratic Republicans that tussled with Federalists, and some people consider Andrew Jackson's transformation of the party when he was president to be the starting point of today's Democratic Party. But in any case, today it is Democrats versus Republicans, and although the level of competition has shifted between the two major parties over time, the fact that they've been both relatively stable and staples of American government for 170 years is a lot different than the 2-party systems before. So in a way, that has changed a lot since America was founded. And another aspect of that party dynamic is that third parties and independents also used to be a lot more competitive. Now, they still didn't take that many offices compared to the main parties and have rarely made noise in presidential elections, but you did see them win a lot more often, and they were a lot more common in congressional and state level elections way back when. As some examples, in the U.S. House from 1837, when Whigs first took congressional seats, to 1905, there was at least one third party or independent member of the U.S. House, and most times there was at least a handful of them. And then from 1911 to 1955 in the U.S. House, there was at least one third party or independent U.S. House member for all of those years too, though not nearly as many as there had used to be. Though it was still quite a few, especially compared to today. And in the U.S. Senate, there was not nearly as often third-party and independent members as there was for the U.S. House, partly because the U.S. Senate is a much smaller chamber than the U.S. House is. But there have been some periods where there was more third-party representation than usual, more independent representation than usual. Almost every year from 1847 to 1885, there was a third-party or independent U.S. senator, mostly because of issues relating to the Civil War or after the Civil War and Reconstruction policy. The 1890s and first few years of the 1900s saw a bunch of populist and silver-oriented U.S. senators. Silver policy, as in whether we should be on the silver standard or the gold standard back then, was a very hot topic back then because of how to control inflation, especially for farmers who were trying to figure out how to basically sustain their lives and their livelihoods by growing crops. And the 1920s through 1940s saw at least one farmer labor and or progressive U.S. senator. Now, farmer labor is something much more specific to the state of Minnesota, where they are now part of the Democratic Party. It's their Democratic Farmer Labor Party in that state. Nowadays, though, you almost never see a third party or independent in Congress. It happens a few times, and there have been a couple in the U.S. House that have switched from Democratic or Republican to an independent or third party in recent memory, but that was right before they either retired or they decided not to run for re-election, or they tried to run for re-election, but they were defeated. Justin Amash, I believe is how you say his last name, in Michigan a few years ago, was a Republican during Donald Trump's first stint as president, was very outspoken against Trump. I believe he changed to a libertarian, and I want to say he did run for re-election. Oh, no, I think he did decline to run for re-election, and I think he tried to run again later on, but was not successful. So he's just one example, and there have been some that have changed to independents. And yes, there are a couple of independents in the U.S. Senate right now, Angus King and Bernie Sanders, but they caucus with Democrats and vote so often with Democrats that they often are just considered Democrats anyways. And there have been a few that have changed to independent right before they left, like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. But they, in terms of like actually winning elections as independents or third parties and staying that way as the independents and third parties, you pretty much never see that anymore unless it's Bernie Sanders or Angus King. And over time, third-party choices have decreased on the ballot as well, and ballot access has been restricted for them. And there's this assumption that if you're voting third-party, you're just wasting a vote. So that's made third-party office holders a lot less common as well. And also the strongholds of Democrats and Republicans have shifted dramatically over time, too. States that used to always vote Republican then became Democrats, or if they voted specifically Republican in presidential elections, they eventually shifted to Democrat, and vice versa. Republicans used to be very robust in the Northeast, and now they're pretty clearly the minority party in most of those states like Massachusetts and New York. Democrats used to dominate in the South, and you almost never saw a Republican in office in those states way back when. Now, Democrats are clearly the minority in most of those states like Florida or Texas. And so these kinds of party changes that seem bizarre now, you see the way that some states are so heavily one party or another now. They used to be the other party. You might look at them now and be like, wait, this state used to be Republican? This state used to be Democrat? It might sound crazy, but things change a lot over the course of 2.5 centuries. And another thing that has changed a lot in that time is that we've shifted from a patronage or spoils system to a lot more civil service-oriented system when it comes to federal jobs. For most of the first 100 years of America, federal jobs in politics was based on this spoils system or patronage. It wasn't just about, it's who you know. It's about what you've done for those people that you know. So they aren't just going to necessarily put you in just because, hey, this is my campaign manager's son. I'm just going to put him in this federal job. No, they had to have actually done something for you and for the party to actually get into office. And Andrew Jackson, in particular, used the spoils system to its fullest extent when he was president. And this spoils system existed well into what is called the Gilded Age, and that's the era that describes the late 19th century after Reconstruction, because there was a lot of considerable economic expansion during that time. And on the surface, everything seemed great. But underneath it, the seedy underbelly, there was this rampant corruption in business and politics. That was, at least in the case of civil service reform, until a turning point in the 1880s. So at this point, Republicans were divided between two factions. There was half-breeds and there were stalwarts. Half-breeds were Republicans that supported merit-based reforms, while stalwarts supported patronage. And President James A. Garfield, a half-breed, had proposed civil service reforms. Unfortunately, he would not see it come to fruition as he was assassinated in 1881 by Charles Guiteau. Guiteau was a stalwart, and he was mentally ill, and he was very upset that he had not received a federal job for his work for the party. As a stalwart, he thought he should get it because look what he did for the party. Besides that, though, Guiteau is, at least allegedly, he was alleged to have said that I am a stalwart of the stalwarts, Arthur is president. And that Arthur he was referring to was Vice President Chester A. Arthur. Even though Garfield was a half-breed, Arthur was a stalwart. It was sort of try to be a compromise between the two factions. And so Chester A. Arthur assumed the presidency. So Chester A. Arthur must have decided to do away with the civil service reforms, right? After all, he was a stalwart. Actually, no. To probably everybody's surprise, Chester Arthur actually carried forward the civil service reform, and he would sign the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883. And among the Pendleton Civil Service Act's provisions for federal workers is that they would have open and competitive exams based on merit. So basically, how well do you know the job? You would be protected from firing based on political motives. So they just didn't like your politics. They couldn't remove you just because of that. Prohibiting the government from requiring civil servants to campaign for them. You could not make them do that either. So if you were somebody in office or you wanted them to campaign for somebody in office, you could not coerce them to do that. And it also established the Civil Service Commission to enforce this merit system. Now, at the time, the law only covered about 10% of federal government employees. So it wasn't a huge, wide-ranging bill that you might have expected it to be. But it was an immense step forward. And since then, the Civil Service Act and civil service reform has been expanded to apply to the vast majority, somewhere around 90% of federal employees. And the federal government has also grown considerably since then. So not just percentage-wise, but just the sheer number of people that are covered by the civil service reforms is a lot more expansive too now. Now, that's not to say that there are no politics played whatsoever anymore when it comes to who gets federal jobs and who applies to federal jobs, and who gets removed from federal jobs. But it is exceedingly more difficult to do that than it used to be. It is much more difficult to try to play politics with who gets federal jobs. Now, that's what has changed the most over 250 years, at least things that you might not realize have changed tremendously over 250 years. But let's look to the future. What will change the most over the next 250 years? And this doesn't have to be entirely what we think will happen, but some things that we would like to happen could be there too. I'm not necessarily saying all of these are things I want specifically. And let's also try to look at this much more positively, at least neutrally. Now, I know that's very hard. I know it's very easy to look at the doom and gloom. I've talked about that on several recent episodes of the podcast. And I'll be honest, I am not exactly the dictionary definition of an optimist myself. But let's think about positive things. Let's assume that America is still here 250 years in the future. Or even if you don't want to think that far, what are some of the things that might change the most over the next 50 years, or whatever number you want to use? And there are a few that I'm going to talk about specifically, but there's just like how the talk about what has changed the most is super expansive, so is talking about what could change tremendously. In fact, this might be an even more expansive conversation, but I'll just highlight a few things. Number one is government accessibility. And I put this in the same vein as government transparency. Despite 250 years, there are still tons of problems with government accessibility. Enough that I want to make a podcast episode on it in the future. In the near future, hopefully. Now, obviously, in some ways, government has become more accessible because of how much faster information travels, how much you can just easily look up information, how much you can actually travel yourself to get this information. But there are still so many things that can be improved. We don't teach how to research government well. And it's also hard to find unbiased information. So sometimes we get frustrated with what we think is people not researching things. And yes, some people just don't go and research things on their own and they're lazy about it. But some people just don't know where to go. And we don't teach them very well. And sometimes we think we know it better than we actually do. Another way that governments are inaccessible, especially local governments, they get very little media attention, save for the biggest cities like New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago or whatever other big city you want to use. Miami. Besides those states, you really don't see local areas talked about that much. Maybe some of the biggest counties too, but a lot of people don't realize just how important local government is, and it's harder to find information about local government. Kind of a catch-22. People don't care as much about local government because they think it doesn't matter because it doesn't get covered as much, and it doesn't get covered as much because people think it doesn't matter and that they don't care about it. And even if you want to look up these local governments, it's mostly just the biggest ones that have information about them. These special districts that a lot of people don't realize, like water districts, police and fire districts, they're very hard to find information about, especially even for those of us who are involved in politics for a living, which I've talked about before. When people who are involved in politics for a living, like me, have trouble finding this information, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to expect people who don't follow politics for a living to be able to do it. Government websites often suck because they don't get updated. They're hard to navigate. They are just flat out missing info. All sorts of ways that websites for local governments and even state governments too, it's just a slog to go through them, or they look like they haven't been updated forever, or they look like they were made with early 2000s GeoCities. There's so much there that can be improved too. And rural areas have very little access to broadband internet, and that's an issue that's becoming more and more salient across both parties. But I think we will see a lot of significant improvements to many of these things as the lack of accessibility is becoming a bipartisan issue that both major parties are seeking to fix to some extent. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of debate and dissent on how to fix it, but at least recognizing that these are problems and having people across the political spectrum recognize these are problems is an important first step to have. So I think you will see a lot of improvements on that front when it comes to government accessibility. At least I hope so. Another tremendous change that is going to be coming, or is coming, and is already here, is artificial intelligence. Now, I know it's a very scary topic right now, and I'm not a fan exactly of it myself either. It's unfortunate how much it's becoming a part of our everyday lives. It's everywhere, but it is here to stay and it's becoming more ubiquitous. But for as much as it is used for evil, selfish, and nefarious ends, there is also a lot of potential for it to do good and improve government function. It could make government websites more accessible. It could help regular people understand debates better, like being able to parse what candidates are saying, or the different sides of policy debates, and so on. It could compare and contrast how different governments operate based on a variety of factors and inform us about how we can improve our own government's functions and structures. In episode 83, with my guest Ramon Perez, he discussed the use of AI and how it can improve government transparency and accountability. Now, again, I know artificial intelligence is scary, and it will be used for improper ends, and it can also be used to make government less accessible and less transparent, and make policies even harder to understand by giving people bad information. But there is a lot of potential for it to not do those things too, and to make us more prepared for false information. But artificial intelligence is going to transform how we engage with government and how government operates, whether we like it or not. Another thing you're going to see a lot of in 250 years, another 250 years, is more shifts in party loyalties. Now, when you're in the thick of things, it's very easy to miss the forest for the trees, so to speak, because you're in the thick of things. You think, oh, there's no way these things are going to change. We don't realize trends are happening until we're actually looking at them in the rearview mirror. And it often takes a long time to sustainably change the party affiliation of states and other large areas. Republican states don't become Democratic overnight. Democratic states don't become Republican overnight. But 250 years, yeah, party loyalties are guaranteed to shift over the course of that time. And even 50 years, too. But what will that look like? Where will it happen? Why will it happen? That's hard to say. We have this concept in politics called a realigning election. And some elections are looked at as these watershed moments where the demographics of the parties have shifted over time. And depending on who you ask, some people would say 2016 with Donald Trump's first election is a realigning election. Not everybody agrees with that. But what you have seen a lot of is since the 60s, there's been what is sometimes called a great sorting out, where instead of like what seems like to be an overnight switch, it's just a slow, gradual change where you saw states in the North gradually shift from Republican to Democrat, especially in the Northeast. You saw states in the South shift from Democrat to gradually more Republican. Now, what is that going to look like in the future? Which areas of the country are going to suddenly shift towards Republicans when they've been Democratic, or shift towards Democrats when they've been Republican? I mean, who knows? It could be some sort of issue that we haven't seen yet that really turns everything on its head. Again, it's hard to really say when you're in the middle of things, but it's going to happen at some point over 50 years, 100 years, 150, 200, 250 years. It may be another candidate that is completely different than anything we've ever seen before and is incredibly galvanizing in a different way that cuts across different political groups that you otherwise thought would not mesh together. It's hard to say right now, but it's going to happen at some point where things that we think are here to stay now, that Democratic areas that are never going to become Republican, and Republican areas that are never going to become Democratic, they're going to change at some point. And then lastly, there's obviously going to be a ton of different changes to election rules and formats, because those are always continually refined and changed. Now, depends on what level of government you're talking about and where, but there's going to be a lot of that change. Like some offices at the state level, they often shift between whether they're elected or appointed. So some of those are going to go from appointed to elected, or elected to appointed. Elected being that they're chosen by regular voters, and then appointed meaning they're appointed by somebody in the government, typically a governor. Will that happen at the federal level, where we might elect more than just president and Congress? Maybe we'll elect a member of the cabinet. I don't necessarily see that happening, but 250 years is a long time. Maybe we will see it. Or maybe there's an office that we don't even have yet that will eventually be created, and then that is elected. I don't know. That kind of thing would require a change to the U.S. Constitution, or at least it would likely need a change to the U.S. Constitution. Will we see term limits for U.S. Supreme Court? Right now, U.S. Supreme Court has lifetime appointments. That might pick up steam with how much people are losing their faith in the Supreme Court, and a lot of it is based on political views, whether they agree with the court's rulings. Typically, Republicans are more approving of the Supreme Court right now than Democrats are, just because of some of the rulings being more conservative and more favoring Republicans lately. Will we see age limits on Congress and other offices that don't already have them? You see state-level courts, a lot of them use it for their judges where they have to leave at a certain age. I think this one will be picking up more steam because it seems to have gained some traction. In one of my earliest episodes, actually, maybe my first episode of the podcast, talked about the age of elected officials and whether we would see potential maximum age limits on members of Congress. It's not going to be one fell swoop. It's going to be each state doing it on their own. But it does seem to be getting to be a more and more accepted idea across Republican and Democratic lines, and independents too. We'll probably see some more areas that use ranked choice voting, where each candidate on the ballot is ranked 1, 2, 3, however many candidates there are, and you choose them based on order of preference. You'll probably see more of those because that has started to pick up traction over time. Now, how extensive will that be? It'll probably be more extensive at the local level, and with enough time, might be picked at the state level. Federal level, well, some states that use ranked choice voting already do use it for state and federal offices, but it is very rare to see that. But that will almost undoubtedly be expanded in use, ranked choice voting. And who knows, with another 50 to 100 years, we may see it become the primary way that we choose elected officials. Or maybe we see more multi-member districts. There's a few of those already in states where districts have more than one person representing them. So the vast majority of states for the state legislative level, and then Congress also does one person per district, but most state legislatures do one representative per one senator per district. There's a few other states, like, for example, Vermont actually does it in both their state house and their state senate, where they have 2, 3, or even more people in a district. And so you might perhaps see more and more of those kinds of districts be adopted. I haven't personally seen a lot of talk about doing that more and more. Not going to say that there's no way it wouldn't happen, because you never know what's going to happen, but that might be something to watch out for. And then lastly, will we maybe see adoption of proportional representation? Now, this one is a tricky one because that would require a lot of legal changes. It would almost certainly require a change to the U.S. Constitution, where the apportionment of seats is based on the number of votes that were received in that area. So if a district has 5 seats and Republicans got 60% of the vote and Democrats got 40% of the vote, Republicans would receive 60% of the seats and Democrats would receive 40% of the seats, instead of it just being a winner-take-all like you see in the vast majority of cases in U.S. elections. And with gerrymandering in full swing, maybe proportional representation will be seen as the solution to that. And with a lot of the discussion about how third parties and independents get shut out of elections a lot of times, you might see this as the way to involve more third-party competition or independent competition. Who knows? But that may be another major change you see. But you always got to remember, there's a lot of things that stay the same in politics, but there's a ton that also changes, especially a lot of these details. And you never know what the future holds, and some things can surprise you quite a bit when you're talking about 2.5 centuries. But in any case, whether you're optimistic, pessimistic, or neutral, it's going to be very interesting to see just how much changes even further over the course of 250 years. Now, obviously, we won't be alive at that point. Or at least I assume we won't be alive at that point. But nonetheless, it'll be interesting for future generations to see. And while we are still alive, it'll be interesting to see how much it changes over time. But that's going to do it for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, and share and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Links to the show notes. My other works include 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively mitigate polarization in politics and toxicity in politics. My book on political independence, which is available on several retailers, but especially on Amazon, and my writings on medium.com. And other links are my Facebook page, LinkedIn, websites, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. So, wrapping things up here. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.